So I guess we'll get started and people will join along the way. Welcome, and we're very glad to have you with us for this forum on educational funding. This is being offered by the Education Task Force of FCCPR. For those of you who don't know, Franklin County Continuing the Political Revolution formed 2015 around the Bernie campaign, and we've kept going. And it's really an issue-centered group that focuses on issues. Sometimes they'll get involved in political campaigns, but it's mostly in service to issues. And our primary work is done through task forces. We have an education task force, which is hosting tonight. We also have task forces focused on reproductive justice, on housing, climate, single-payer insurance, and peace. We've had other task forces that have stepped forward at other times, and that could happen again. And housing, I'm sorry to leave that out. And we hope you will consider joining with us. We're a volunteer organization, and what we do is what gets done. So we'd love to have you work with us. I want to talk a little bit about tonight's forum. It's focused on educational funding in Massachusetts, really built around the question that if we love our children the way we say we do, and if we think that education is the great equalizer and the key to the success of our children and our future, the way we say we do, then why is it that every year we seem to not have enough money to do well by our schools and by our children? What's the problem there? And more importantly, what can we do about it? We live in a very wealthy state. In the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And yet schools all across our state struggle to survive and to do well by all of our students. So what's that about? Tonight, we're going to explore that, to learn more about how funding works in our state, to have some idea of maybe where some of the pitfalls are, where the sticking places are, and then to talk together about what maybe we can do about it. We have a number of people on the screen and in the forum who are going to be helping us go into more detail about how things work. The overall layout of the evening is as follows. We're going to do some basic, I would say, education funding 101 and probably a little bit of education funding 102. It's not simple stuff. Tracy Novick and Jesus Leva, we're going to be walking us through some basic information. And following that, there's going to be 15 minutes of time in breakout rooms for people to process with each other, to think about what you've heard, to really consider what you've heard, to identify what your questions are, maybe to compare notes about what's happening in your district if you're coming from a district, and how that works. And when we come back from that, there's going to be a discussion of everybody in the room, but we're going to have a panel of folks who are pretty wise in these matters to help us think through what are our questions, what have we learned, what do we still need to learn, and what actions can we take to make things better. So that's the layout of the evening. It's a 2-hour forum, and that time is going to go quickly. A couple of housekeeping notes. One is we're going to ask you to stay muted unless you're the one speaking, and then we'll remind you to unmute. If you have questions, we're going to ask you to write them down so you remember them, because we're not going to deal with questions until we come back from breakout rooms. But we are going to take questions in the order they're asked, and we're going to ask you to ask them by putting something in the chat, something that says, I have a question, something really basic, and then we will be monitoring the chat, and we'll just go through them in order that they come in, and we will deal with those questions. But again, no questions in the first half of the meeting. We're just going to go with the presentations, and then after breakout, we'll take questions. And I think that's really it. So we're going to start with presentations with Tracy Novick. Tracy Novick, actually, I was sort of talking with her before the meeting started, that part of this is her fault. This meeting, 2018, she did a presentation to the Greenfield School Committee about funding, and highlighted a couple of areas where the costs of actually doing what schools do was not anywhere near matched what the funding that came from the state was about. And sort of laying things out in detail made it a question that could be asked. Why aren't we getting the funding we need? What's that about? And that actually people can figure that out. And Tracy's one of those people. Unfortunately, she's here with us tonight. She comes from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, and she's going to get us started with Ed Funding 101 and 102, a little bit of an introduction to how it all works. So Tracy, we're all yours.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start by, of course, sharing my screen, as these things always are. I should, actually, no, I can't find it. I laugh to hear that, some of this is my fault, because it's very much of what any of you who have ever taught find out, right? Which is that, you introduce them to this much, and then it turns out that you need to know this much more. So I think that's some of what we're running into tonight. So this presentation is school funding in Massachusetts, how it works, how it doesn't, and what is changing. And I know Rob O'Donnell is on here. I want to give him a lot of credit. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's school finance office is what I consider an exemplar in terms of sharing information and having information available. And just about everything here is kind of my filter of information that originally came from there. So I'd like to ground people in language as much as I present a lot about numbers. I'm actually an English major since college, actually, and I think it's important for people to kind of know where any of these things that we're talking about come from. And so when we talk about school funding in Massachusetts, very oftentimes we use the term Chapter 70. I think it's probably already come up this evening. Any of you who are on school committees use it. Certainly the legislature uses it. But I think it's one of those where we use it so often in, what does it actually mean? So Chapter 70 is simply a reference to Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, Section 1, which is where it lays out how it is that we actually fund schools in Massachusetts. And really the first thing that I want to make sure that folks know is that there is actually a statewide standard of how we fund schools in Massachusetts. And at the time that this law was passed, that wasn't necessarily all that common. It's grown increasingly common over the last number of years. But MGL 70 is actually where it spells out in actual language, what it is that we're doing when we fund schools in Massachusetts. And so the law, it's that first section sets up two things that actually are supposed to be happening as a result of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70. The first is it's setting up what the state terms a fair and adequate minimum for a public education for children in K through 12 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And then the second thing that it does, which I think is the part that people maybe are less familiar with, is it sets up another standard for how that actually gets funded. And so we're going to talk about both of those at a pretty high level. I'm not going to give you a lot of numbers tonight. Not going to sort of give you that deep dive, but I want you to understand at least sort of the concepts in terms of how these pieces come together. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how much does it cost to educate a child in Massachusetts? So effectively, when they set up this system of school funding back in 1993, what they did was they came up with a list of what it took to educate a kid. And I think that, if you sat around this evening and we gave you paper and pencil and asked you to come up with a list of what does it take to fund a school system, and we, didn't let the school committee members on here participate because that would be cheating, you would come up with probably a list that would look a lot like this. Might take you a little bit to maybe have all of the pieces here, but we all are going to come up with teaching, and we're all going to think about the fact that they need supplies of some kind. And it's not going to take you too long to realize that they need, some sort of a building, and that's going to need some kind of maintenance, and teachers need professional development, and teachers need health insurance, and there needs to be some sort of structure that's actually trying to keep track of things happen the way that they're supposed to, and so forth. And really, that's all that this is here. And so those are the categories that get funded in Massachusetts in what we call the base foundation amount. So what we're constructing here is what is called the foundation budget. And a lot of people push really hard on the notion that it's a foundation and we build on top of foundations. I will say that I maybe am less fond of that as an image, only because what we really are saying we're doing here, per Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, Section 1, is that we're providing a fair and adequate minimum for students. And fair and adequate should mean that it's enough. But in any case, for every student in Massachusetts that is in public education, there is a base foundation amount assigned to them. And it's done by grade level. So there's a division for if you had half-day kindergarten, if you had full-day kindergarten, if you had elementary school, middle school, high school. Those are the base foundation amounts. There is also one for vocational education, which is the highest of the categories. And that is, of course, because their class sizes are smaller and they have greater amounts of equipment. So those pieces are in there. Now, I want to point out two things that are actually within that base foundation amount. The first is that health insurance is in there. Any of you, regardless of what you're doing, I suspect, are well aware that the cost of health insurance are well in excess, going up year by year, going well in excess of the rate of inflation, kind of regardless of how you measure inflation. That has been an issue, of course, for public education for the past 15 or 20 years. The other thing that was in there was special education. And Massachusetts honestly has a very proud history in terms of this. We were pretty early off the ground, although lamentably late, depending on how you look at it. We were ahead of the national trend in terms of public education. And special education has enormously expanded in terms of the number of students that are being served by public schools, about the number of the kinds of things that we actually do with students. It has improved in its services, it's improved in what we do, but largely as a consequence of all of that, it also has become significantly more expensive over the years. And so that's in here too. So keep that in mind. Those are two things we're going to come back to. Now, the state then adds to those two things a recognition that students who have additional kinds of needs are going to cost additional amounts of money. Okay. And this, by the way, is something that, again, has become more a part of more school funding systems in the United States, but was not necessarily something that was being widely done in the 1990s when this came together. So the two categories that have this increment on top are for English learners, for students who are, per the access testing that the district does, still testing as learning English, and for low income. Now, I'm going to give you an extra slide on low income, because part of what we're talking about here is not just how the foundation budget works now, but how it's changing. And in terms of the story of kind of where the money is and where the money is changing, low income is really where the focus of the story is right now. So this chart is actually one of the only dollar charts I'm going to give you, but I think it's important for people to see it because for the House 1 budget, so for the budget that was proposed by Governor Healy in March, these are the increments per pupil for low-income students in Massachusetts. Now, I want a couple of things to note. First of all, there are 12 different ones. That's based on the percentage of students within their school district that are considered low income. It obviously is also a very progressive funding system, right? It goes up at the end. So the greater percentage of students in your school district that are considered low income, the significantly larger amount of money that you get per each of those students. Again, within the foundation budget. Remember, all we're doing right now is calculating how much it's going to cost. We haven't figured out who's going to pay for it yet. Now, something that is really crucial here. Okay, so sorry, let me back up a step. For each of your districts, all of these numbers, right? So these base foundation amounts these increments over it. And I also didn't talk about special education. Special education is a percentage that the state calculates based on your enrollment. It does not have anything to do with how many students have special education needs. The state's you're gonna look at these categories over here. These were your boxes that were building up behind the student that we said, if you came up with a list, this is what it would cost. Those are going down the left-hand category. Then we actually take your enrollment. Now it is your actual enrollment, but it is your actual enrollment as of October of last year. So there's always a 1-year lag in terms of what your changes may be in terms of your enrollment. These are the base foundation categories here, right? Number of kids you have in preschool, full day, elementary, middle, high school, and vocational education. You've got a special education. Those are, again, flat sort of, this is a percentage of your student enrollment, not based on the number of students who have those needs. Then your low income, those are based on the actual count, and English learners. Taking those together, really all that we've got here is a big multiplication problem that has a little bit of addition in it, right? So there were dollar amounts associated with each of the students for base foundation, increment for each of the other, for the students who had those needs. Those get added together at the end here, and you end up with a larger total here at the bottom, which effectively is the state saying, so the fair and adequate minimum for the Greenfield Public Schools for FY24, again, just based on the governor's budget, House One, would be $27.9 million. Now, a couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind at this point. The Student Opportunity Act, which I'm sure you've heard much talk of, and I see there's a couple of legislators on here. Something that I think is actually really kind of important to say about the Student Opportunity Act is that it was passed unanimously by both chambers. I don't think that happens very often. I don't spend all that much time in the legislature, but I think that's something that we should really be very proud of. And that then convinced Governor Baker that he needed to sign it in November of 2019. So the Student Opportunity Act was signed in November of 2019, but due to the pandemic, we effectively missed a year of implementation. As a result, what was supposed to be a 7-year implementation is now a 6-year implementation. FY24 is year 3. So the year that we're currently in, FY23, is only year 2. So we're only a third of the way into a 6-year implementation. So I sometimes start to lose my temper a little bit with people who are like, the SOA is not doing anything for my district. We're only a third of the way in. Next year will only be a half of the way in. So keep that in mind as we go. There are 4 things that, in terms of the foundation budget, matter in the Student Opportunity Act. And all of them are things that we've actually mentioned. So the SOA sets aside a different inflation rate for just health insurance, okay? It's designed to say, yes, health insurance is going to go up by percentages that are higher than the rest of the inflation, the rest of the budget. Now, marginally funny, it hasn't actually been very different, I guess darkly funny, but the theory is there. There also is an increase in the percentage of in-district special education students. So that sort of, in terms of your overall enrollment, there's a percentage that's assumed to be receiving special education services. That is actually going up. There's also an increase in the dollar amount per pupil for English learners. And again, these are things that are on a 6-year phase-in over the next number of years. And then there's also this increase in the dollar amount per pupil for the low income students. Now this, as I noted when I gave you the chart, is really where the big story is. Okay, so by the time we get to full implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, with another 3 years after FY24, if you think about that bar chart that went way up towards the end, that last bar will be equivalent to the base foundation amount for a middle school student. And effectively, to put it a different way, you'll receive there will be another 100% for a student in the districts that have the highest percentage of low income students. Okay, so it's intended to be a very strong statement in terms of recognizing that poverty plays a significant role in education for students, and also that concentrations of poverty mean that districts actually need that much more resources in order to make sure that they're effectively serving students. Now, a couple of things just quickly in terms of, that was the chart and it was nice and neat and Rob does a great job. But once it starts hitting the ground, what does this look like? Districts are required to spend no less than 95% of this amount each year. This has been less of an issue, but it actually is setting a minimum of that. Most spend more. We're going to come back to that point as we go. Note that those boxes didn't include all the things that districts spend money on. Most notably, it of course doesn't include transportation. However, it also doesn't include things like rental, doesn't include adult education, doesn't include crossing guards. And also, of course, those are things that are sort of within those categories. If you're spending money that's from grants or that's on your capital, you're building a building, you're doing major repairs, those are going to be a separate kind of spending. This is intended, again, as that fair and adequate minimum from MGL Chapter 70, Section 1. And do keep in mind, I'm going to keep saying this, FY24 will be year 3 of a 6-year implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. So we are in the middle of a big change right now. So that was that $27.9 million for Greenfield. Everybody has their dollar amount. Then we got to figure out how are we going to get this $27.9 million for Greenfield? Okay, so underlying everything in this next stage is a base assumption, which didn't used to be written down, interestingly. Only in the Student Opportunity Act was this written down, even though it was underlining it even before. So the foundation budget starts from an assumption that at the state level, if you take the full foundation budget for all of the districts in Massachusetts, it's going to be funded with 59% local funding and 41% state funding. Okay, so that's kind of like this underlying agreement that is before we get any farther. So think about that sort of big number. If you take Greenfield and you add it to Pioneer Valley Regional and Mohawk Regional, and you add it to Northampton and to Worcester and to Boston, to everybody else, 59% of that is going to be funded locally and 41% of it's going to be funded by the state. So how is the state going to then figure out where all of this money is going to come from? Well, it's going to do a calculation. It's going to do it at the state level, and then it's going to pull a number out of here that it's then going to apply to the local level. This, by the way, is the most complicated thing that I actually ever have to explain, and I'm going to intentionally do it not with a lot of numbers, but don't be too, if you get the concept without the numbers, then we're doing okay. So what happens is that the state takes, and this is DOR stuff, the state takes the taxable value of property and it sets it equivalent to the Department of Revenue income taxes at the state level. Okay, and it says, okay, so if we're gonna take all of the taxable property value and we're gonna take all of the Department of Revenue. In each case, by the way, it's a year or two out of phase, so that people who do things like dispute their taxes have some time to do that. The way that you set two numbers equal, some of you may have a vague recollection of this, and some of you just may use this all the time, is that one of those numbers is going to be greater than 1, and one of those numbers is going to be less than 1. So when the state did the calculation for this year, it came up with these 2 decimals. Now, the reason that these 2 decimals end up mattering is we're going to take these 2 decimals out of this calculation, and we're then going to go apply it to Greenfield and to Worcester and to Brewster and to Great Barrington and to everywhere in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to figure out how much they can afford to spend on their schools. Because remember, the second part of the Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 70, is we had to come up with some standard way of measuring the ability to pay. And that's how we do it, okay? So these happen to be the statewide numbers in terms of here's how much the taxable property in Massachusetts is, here's how much the entire revenue was. In this case, it's actually 2020. Okay, we can actually do the calculation here for them, for the state, right, and come up with these enormous numbers. Okay, but here's why I think this is actually really kind of neat and important. That's the 41% of the foundation budget right there. Okay, that's the calculation. Now, we also then do the same calculation for Greenfield. We take Greenfield's taxable property, we take Greenfield's actual DOR reported income tax, we multiply it by these same percentages, and we're going to come up with a thing. So let me show you, and again, there's the quote from MGL chapter 70. Let me show you what that looks like. So here's one of Rob's great charts. Okay, we have the equalized property valuation up here in the upper left-hand corner in terms of what was Greenfield's equalized property valuation, taxable property for 2022. Okay, here's that friendly 0.3534 percentage. We're going to multiply that against the equalized valuation. We get $6.1 million. Okay, same deal we're going to do with income. Okay, and again, for the income, the uniform property valuation is, sorry, the uniform income percentage is the 1.53. Okay, now, so that's the standard calculation. We can do this for any city or any town, and we come up with a combined effort yield. Now, I think the combined effort yield is actually really neat, and here's why. If we run this same calculation for Boston or for any other place in Massachusetts, for Northampton, for Springfield, for Brewster, for Provincetown, you come up with a standard calculation of how much that community can afford to contribute to public education. If we take this and we take the foundation budget, we now have two standard numbers of this is how much Greenfield's fair and adequate minimum for schools are. This is how much Greenfield can afford to pay towards it. Now, it's a little bit more, there's a couple of extra steps here in terms of how we then actually move forward, okay? The next step down in terms of 8 and 9 is you see your friendly foundation budget there, $29.7 million. The agreement is that every community is going to get at least some Chapter 78. Okay, so no community is required to contribute more than 82.5% of their foundation budget. So in other words, on the other side, every community is going to get at least 17.5% of their foundation budget in Chapter 78. So that does not look like that's probably anywhere near where Greenfield can afford, right? $24 million is not actually what the number's coming from. So the target local contribution is always the lesser of those two numbers. And then we convert that into a percentage of their foundation budget. So the target local share for Greenfield in terms of what are we aiming to have Greenfield contribute to their schools is 43.3% of their foundation budget. Now we do a couple of little extra things over here. Okay, we look at how much the required contribution was last year, which was $11.6 million. And then we say, okay, so how much did Greenfield's local economy grow last year? It grew by 3.28%. And then that gives you a preliminary contribution. So in other words, these numbers don't kind of just exist in this vacuum. There is some basis to sort of where you came from last year, what happened over the course of the year, and then you end up with a preliminary local contribution as a percent of foundation. And then of course, we're going to compare that against that target from the bottom left-hand corner. And there's always a little calculation here at the bottom that's going to, if those two numbers don't match, if your preliminary local contribution as a percent of foundation doesn't match your local target, it's going to bring you up if it's particularly below, or in the rare occasions where it's above, it will nudge you down a smidge. That's a very mathematical term, right? So what we end up with here then is a calculation saying that for the town of Greenfield, the calculation is that we're aiming to have the local contribution be 40.64% of the foundation budget, with 59.36% of the foundation budget coming from the state. Now I'm going to run you through a couple of other examples here around the local area, just to give you really the pie charts. I know that people respond differently to numbers in terms of, what's the most effective way of doing it. I found that giving you a lot of graphs to look at can be an effective way of sort of making the point that a lot of these graphs are going to look very different depending on the community. Okay, so here's Northampton. I'm not going to walk you through all the numbers, but in terms of where does Northampton end up at the end of this, their preliminary local contribution note is, you can already see, is 78.08%. The bottom of the page, they end up with a contribution as a percent of foundation of 78.83%. Okay, so if you look at Northampton's foundation budget, their local target share, their local share, sorry, is 78.83%. Most of their contribution is going to be local rather than at the state, okay? Different contribution. Now, their charts are different for the regionals because, of course, we have to put all of those towns together. There is one of those calculations for each of the towns, but we can then sort of say, okay, but as a regional, what is their target aid share? This is the target, please note, okay? We're going to talk about something else in a minute, but in terms of the balance here, again, okay, what can those towns afford versus how much of it's coming from the state? Note the difference again here, okay? Gil-Montague, you're going to end up with something that looks a little bit closer to 50-50. Amherst Pelham, okay, chapter 70 versus the actual contribution, again, the target, the degree to which local contribution is carrying it versus the state is carrying it, again, very different, okay? And remember, based on the same standard calculation of wealth, you can with income and properties. And here's Pioneer Valley Regional. Now, that's not all. It doesn't stop there, as many of you are aware, okay? First, the state has a step, and then really the local communities have a step. So I'm going to briefly touch on both of those. Now, the state's calculation, if we stopped there, okay, we would end up with something that said, this is your foundation budget. We got you to your foundation budget, and we could then step away. We don't, however, okay? The state does something, really two things that are additional. The state has made a commitment, which now again is written into the Student Opportunity Act. Previously, it was informal, that no community will receive less state aid than they have gotten the year before. Okay, so this is called hold harmless aid. Now, I think in Massachusetts, we have a sense that this is just sort of the natural way of things. Let me note that a number of states are actually moving to phase it out because it doesn't actually have any relationship, of course, to any of the calculations that we just have done. It's just very simply, okay, you already had that, so we're going to give you that again. All right, it's not based on need in terms of the measurements we have here, in terms of the standard measurements. It's not based on any of the other kinds of things that we've incorporated here. So keeping that in mind, okay, I'm going to give you Gil-Montague, and we'll come back to why I'm using Gil-Montague as an example in a second. So the way that your foundation budget always comes together is that your local required contribution comes in first. The red bar, by the way, is the foundation budget for Gil-Montague. And then your foundation aid is designed to get you from your local contribution to your foundation, okay? So if we were going to just do foundation budgets, we would walk away here. However, if we did that, Gil-Montague would be getting less state aid than they got last year. So to that, the state adds hold harmless aid, about $100,000. And then something that some of you are very familiar with, the minimum aid increase, which is a $30 per pupil increase over last year. So that's another $29,000. So I do think it's important we talk about sort of how much money our district's getting. It's all of these pieces together. And we should remember that those minimum aid increases are on top of hold harmless funding that is already over and above the foundation budget funding. So in terms of looking again at those same sort of group of districts, how much state aid over foundation aid are local districts projected to receive in FY24? Now, keeping in mind that the deal in terms of the foundation budget is to get everybody to that 100%, and also that many districts in Massachusetts have really only been getting to 100%, okay? Here is, again, that same list of districts in terms of their foundation budget, hold harmless aid, and then the minimum aid increase. Now, I'm gonna pick on Rob again for a second. Rob, if Rob's not gonna give you that aid and then say that you can't, that he's gonna require that you actually spend it, in other words, okay? So your required net school spending not only includes your foundation budget, but it also includes the hold harmless aid and the minimum aid increase. You got to spend all of that in public education. Now, what that means is that you end up with this last column, which is if your foundation budget is your fair and adequate minimum, how much are you then required to spend over it, again, with state funding because of the minimum aid increase and because of the hold harmless aid. Now, remember, the hold harmless aid is going to get bigger over time if the foundation budget stays static, because that minimum aid increase builds up over time. You've got last year's minimum aid increase and the year before's minimum aid increase and the year before that's minimum aid increase. And that's how we end up with numbers like Amherst Pelhams. That's how we end up with numbers like Frontier Regionals in terms of what's happening. However, what I want you to keep in mind is this: that isn't the only pressure that's happening right now, because pushing on the other side is the increase in the foundation budget. And in particular, if you're a district that has a high number of low-income students, and if you're a district that receives most of your funding from the state, those are actually pushing districts out of the hold harmless aid, out of the minimum aid increases, and into straightforward foundation aid. And that to me is really the untold story right now, that I'm trying to insist on with districts. The number of districts that are getting hold harmless aid is shrinking, which is good news. It means the Student Opportunity Act is doing what it was designed to do. And we're seeing real changes in a number of districts. And I'm really encouraging districts to do their calculations in terms of where they are on this. Now, let me give you a chart that then this goes back to FY21, because I think this is an important part of the story too. There also, of course, always is the option for local communities to fund more than their foundation budget and more than their required net school spending. And again, as we said earlier, most districts do. Now, do keep in mind that the districts that don't are the districts that are most dependent on state aid, that have the highest number of high need students. If you look at the list of districts that are funding at 100% of foundation, 101% of foundation, up to 105, it's exactly who you think it would be. It's Lawrence, it's Holyoke, it's my district of Worcester, it's Springfield, and so forth. So keep that in mind, because they get funded 100% by the state, and that's it. These percentages are a combination of things. These percentages include the hold harmless aid, but they also include the percentage that districts in many cases contribute over. Okay, in every case of the districts that are listed here, these are all communities that contribute over the required spending. The other thing that I do want to include here, FY21 is the most recent one we have the report on. I am warning everyone who looks at FY21 that the numbers are weird on this, which is not a term of art, but it is actually true. Because remember, transportation doesn't count towards foundation spending, so transportation usually wouldn't be included in this calculation. However, in FY21, a lot of us didn't run school buses for part of the year. And what we did was we took that funding from the transportation account and we put it into things like technology, which count towards the foundation budget. So Worcester, for example, was 110% of foundation, which never actually happens in Worcester's history. And it's because we didn't run school buses for much of the year. So keep that in mind when you look at these numbers. I mean, people may still be living within the same universe, but that does make this a little bit weird. These, again, though, are a combination of these two things together. And the only other thing that I wanted to touch on, because it came up earlier, was school choice, okay, and charter tuition reimbursement. And the only reason I bring them up here is because in both cases, those students are included in the district's foundation budget, but then that funding is removed from the district's Chapter 70 aid to go to wherever it is that those students are. I've put those the description of how they work up here on this screen. We can talk about them at greater length later. I don't want to belabor the point. And then in both cases, there are funding lines that come to the district as a result of those, although they do not come through Chapter 78. And that's all I have for you.
Well, so I lied. It wasn't Education 101 and 102. I think we hit graduate school. An awful lot of information and pretty overwhelming. And hopefully we'll be able to come back and take a look at some of that in a little more detail, with a little more breath attached to it, so that we can understand a little more what's happening. But you certainly get the idea of how overwhelming and complex it all is. There was just an article on the front page of the Recorder today talking about how.
Doug, can I interrupt you for a sec?
Sure.
Let's put people into breakout rooms and try to discuss what questions we really want to ask of panelists.
You want to go to that right now?
I think that's probably what we should do.
Okay. we can do that. I'm going to finish my sentence and then we'll go to breakout rooms. So the article on the front page of the Recorder talked about how the mayor had recognized that it's going to be another tough budget year. And as a result, the money that the local school district was asking for is not going to be, the city can't meet the request, which may result in layoffs and projects that won't be able to be carried out and programs that won't be able to carried out. And recognizing that there are, as Tracy said, local issues, but that this is happening in so many places around the state, they're clearly state issues, and there's a lot to figure out with this. And so part of what we hope you will do this evening is try to make sense of recognizing there are local things to figure out, but there are also things we need to understand about the state if we're going to make a difference around this. So I guess we're going to go to breakout. The little minions inside of Zoom have decided to aim you where they're going to aim you. So after I send you there, you will end up with a few other people. And what we'd like you to do is think about what you heard, what questions have come up for you, what things didn't make sense, what things can you imagine us doing about that. You might also take a couple of minutes to talk with others about what's happening in your district and sort of compare notes about what your experience is and how that matches what you heard from Tracy. So we'll send you to breakout rooms and we will see you in 15 minutes.
are some towns whose combined effort yield is many times what their foundation budget is, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the main reason is that they're very wealthy towns. That's a bit of an oversimplification, because the real criterion is that they are responsible for educating relatively few students given their wealth. But you know, I mean, so in terms of who would pay who would get no aid, well, we could then if you look at the numbers, it makes it pretty clear. I don't have them right in front of me, and I'm not sure we want to get bogged down unless you want to, but I'd be happy to hook up with you afterwards at some point, and we can go over this stuff because I think you might find it interesting.
Yeah.
But
well,
the
I
main
mean,
point is an equity issue. It's not a small number, and
Okay.
it's the poor towns that are getting screwed by the rich towns. In a nutshell,
all right.
light
I guess
oversimplification, but that's what's happening.
Okay. I mean, well, that's okay. I mean, there's a reason why Joe Comerford had sent an email to Northampton saying that she wanted to advocate for removing that 17.5% cap, but I didn't realize it was.
Yeah, we've talked to Senator Comerford. I'm working with a couple of people on trying to get some interest in this, and that's one reason I'm here tonight. Because I thought you guys might be interested, and she's definitely on board.
Well, let's exchange some emails. Maybe. Are you what district are you in?
I'm in Gil Montague. I live over in Millers Falls.
Okay, I'm gonna type in my name into the email chat so that I'm gonna type in my email address if you want to type in yours.
Oh, there we go. There's chat.
At protonmail.com. And if you send me yours, I can write it down.
There you go.
I mean, my understanding of all of this is that well, there's Senate bill, I think it's 987, or it's basically a bill that the total amount for the state, the 41% that the state is responsible for, Senator Lewis is hoping to raise it up to 45%. So we're actually that's actually looking at having the state spend more money as a percentage of the total.
Okay. Okay.
I think that combined with the removal of the 17.5% cap would actually give us a lot of money.
That would give towns around here a lot of money. If we're going to not to change the subject, but we're supposed to, we don't have a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
One question I'd like to raise in this forum is, if the foundation budget is assumed to be an adequate amount to educate students, how come so many towns and districts have to spend more than that? It's not just transportation. It's not just crossing guards. It's not because of the being held harmless.
It's school choice.
Montague spends millions of dollars.
It's school
not
choice.
Just school choice.
It's not?
Well, is it really?
Yeah, for Greenfield, the difference between the foundation budget and net school spending is about $5 million, and $4 million of that is school choice. Yeah, so it's unfortunate. It's school choice, at least. So, well, I mean, when Tracy was talking about it earlier before the forum started, she was saying that for districts locally in Western Mass, where we have a lot of districts to choice into, because there's like a lot of charter schools and a lot of very well-off schools, it's more of a problem. But in the eastern part of the state, it's not as significant. So, I mean, for the western part of the state, one thing we want to be advocating for is more charter school reimbursement. We should find out what Gil Montague's charter school amount is. What their actually, you know what? I could probably figure that out right now. I have it brought up in my
We can look at that.
marks.
I mean, another issue, it's not really a question, but a lot of the funding right now is tied to per pupil. And should we look at understanding how to best fund districts that are losing enrollment? Because you can increase the amount per pupil, but
Right,
if you're losing pupils, that's what happened to Gilmontague. Gilmontague was not in hold harmless in FY
Right.
'23. It went back into hold harmless for FY '24 because it lost 73 kids.
What's
And
the
one
district
question
called
is-
again?
Gilmontague,
All right, give me a second, because I'm
number 674, I think.
674.
Yeah. I mean, one question is if the foundation budget went way down, how is that supposed to work? I mean, does DESI have an answer for how do you spend less money when you've got the same number of buildings? I mean, where do you find the savings? You know,
Can you give
in
me
reality,
what's the name of your district again?
Gil Montague.
Gilmontague.
May I speak?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
So we, this year, in October 21, we had 1604 kids in seats, and this year we're down 1446. So we had a significant loss also, and I am really struggling with how we're going to do that when, how we are going to adequately fund these schools when looking at the way the levy limit is calculated, there's 17,500 left. I am really worried about this.
Well, one question is for DESI is how do they expect you to spend less money on your school system given that enrollment drop? Well, how's that, you know, how, if they were in charge of the school system, how would that work? What would they do? Because I don't think they have an answer.
Hi, so we're starting to get participants back from the break room. Once we get a decent amount, or from the breakout rooms, once we get people back on, please type in your name, and we'll start to queue up all of the questions. We're going to have all of the panelists unmute so that they can introduce themselves really briefly and try to direct questions towards them. We have Joe Comerford and Lindsay Sabadosa and Susanna Whips, who are our legislators from Northampton and Greenfield and from Ethel, I believe. We have Rob O'Donnell, who's from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I don't know why I keep on getting the echo. Doug, can you take over?
I can try taking over. I'm in the process of highlighting our panel, so I'm going through the participants to get them in the center of the screen. But
Okay,
I think, as you were saying, the idea is now we want to collect as many questions as we can and address, or have the panel address those questions. So hang on just
right.
a moment.
Can you hear me all right? Can people hear me? Okay. So we're asking people to start putting questions in the chat they might have for Tracy Novick, who's from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees. She was the person who presented. So specifically, if you have questions about the presentation, put them in the chat for her. We have our legislators, Joe Comerford and Susanna Whips and Lindsay Sabadosa. We have Rob O'Donnell from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. He's the school finance director there. And I believe that's all of our panelists.
Well, we have Martha Thurber. Cheryl Stanton was from superintendent of Mohawk Trails was to be with us, and right before the forum let us know that she is ill. So Martha Thurber, who is part of the school committee there, is at least attending, and we're sort of putting you in the spotlight.
Gonna say, and had no idea that she was going to be in any way a presenter at this. but
So
that's
you may or may not feel
Oh,
comfortable.
you got this, Martha.
Sure.
So, but we're glad to have you with us.
Okay.
All
thank
right, let's, Joe wanted to say something real quick, so let's go to, you want to, no?
I can absolutely. I wanted, I was saying that as if there is a question directed to me, I just wanted to, so Tracy did an unbelievable, exquisite job. I wanted to bring it home a little bit to Western Mass and talk about some specific issues that we see here, in addition to Tracy's expert analysis of how it happens. So whenever it's, whenever it works, it would be my pleasure to talk about that.
All right, our first question is gonna be from Lori Pim Conlon. Can you unmute and ask your question to Tracy?
Hi, thank you. We can kind of skip that. It was one of the pie charts, and then there were numbers elsewhere that got to where I needed to be. So thank you. I'm good.
All right,
And I will
then,
absolutely, I mean, I've already sent in, I sort of tweaked the presentation a little bit since I sent it in, but I can absolutely share the PDF. And of course, honestly, every number that I shared tonight is already on the department's website. You just have to know where to look for it. And I just made some pretty pie charts. So, yep.
okay, let's go to Michael Naughton. Can Michael Naughton unmute?
Yes, I'm here.
Right.
I have a question, maybe for Desi and maybe for the legislators. Out here, declining enrollment is a big problem. And I'm wondering if there's a way for Desi to provide more support for districts with the declining enrollment, since raising funding on a per student basis is less effective in a district that is experiencing declining enrollment.
Does Rob, do you
Yeah.
want to answer that, Rob?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. And I just want to say thank you to Tracy for that great presentation that she gave at the top of the top of the forum here. I was taking notes, Tracy. That was really well done.
Well, that's high praise coming from you, of course.
So on this question, so Tracy talked about the hold harmless aid provision in the formula. So that's certainly one mechanism that is there to support districts with declining enrollment. We don't reset your aid if your enrollment declines.
Well, do you expect the expenses to go down in a district with declining enrollment?
Not necessarily, no.
So this level fund aid, when you've got teachers that want raises and you've got utility costs going up, I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not all that helpful, right?
Yeah, and I will recognize that, we certainly understand that there are districts, that have difficulty achieving the same kinds of economies of scale that other districts in the state have, because they're small, right?
Exactly.
Even if you only have 12 kids in the 4th or 5th grade, you still have to, have a 4th and 5th grade teacher. So I certainly appreciate that. We did sort of look at that issue a few years ago in a report that we did, looking at fiscal conditions in some of the smallest districts
Have you come up
And-
with any policy recommendations to
and-
address that issue?
in the Commonwealth. I think one step that the legislature has taken is to fund the rural aid line item, which is a way to direct some additional funding to districts that are experiencing enrollment declines or have difficulty achieving those economies of scale that we talked about. So that's certainly one funding mechanism that's out there.
Am I right in thinking that aid is still per pupil?
So that aid is sort of I don't know how deep we want to get into that formula, but it's sort of a tiered formula. So it directs more funding to districts that have kind of lower population densities and lower average incomes among local residents. So and the funding is sort of weighted in that way, so that the money is directed to the places that have the smallest populations and the highest economic needs.
And
Just jump in for a second. There is a solution, and the solution was proposed there was a special commission on the fiscal health of rural schools that did a tremendous job of examining what's happening with rural and declining enrollment school districts in the Commonwealth. They issued a report at the end of December that recommended a number of steps that could be taken to help address this issue, including $60 million in aid to rural and declining enrollment schools, and a number of other additional steps. I know that Senator Comerford and Representative Natalie Blaze have legislation to bring some of these recommendations, including that major one, to the legislature this session. So there are, we've had study after study that's shown exactly the problem that you mentioned, that fixed costs do not go down with enrollment. And then there are districts like ours that have had no Chapter 70 increase for over 20 years. And that's impossible for us. And so Senator Comerford and Representative Blaze have filed legislation based on those recommendations that hopefully we can begin to address some of those problems.
I just want to mention really quickly that Greenfield is not a rural school district, although we're surrounded by a lot of rural school districts. Could we get Susan Wargaftik's question?
Yep.
Well,
I've got-
hang on, I think Senator
Okay.
Comerford
Oh,
wants
yeah,
to
go,
respond.
go, Senator. Yep.
I
Sorry.
put a section by section summary of the bill that Martha's talking about in the chat. So that bill is filed, it's real, it's based on the 38 recommendations. It deals directly with many of our communities and that are both low and declining enrollment. These are sisters, right? And we found them to be very similar, although not identical. So I'll stop there.
Susanna Wargaftik.
Yep, okay. There two questions are connected. One is, how is the low income category computed? Like, I know that for different things, low income is different amounts. So I'm just wondering that. And then the connection is to special ed. Lower income communities tend to have more students with special ed needs. Greenfield, for instance, has been having an awful lot of, you have the percentage. You said there's a percentage and not a per pupil fund that is done on that. And it seems to me that considering what it costs to deal with special ed students, that assuming that every town or city has 3.2% special ed students does not make sense. That there really is a connection between lower income and special ed needs. So those are two connected. Thank you.
So I can take those. So the short answer in terms of low income is that it's 185% of the federal poverty rate. The way that Massachusetts does that is it does it through matching, which is that we have what's called direct certification in Massachusetts. So students who are in Mass Health, who receive SNAP, whose families receive SNAP benefits, are in a number of other state programs, are sort of automatically counted. And then the past year or two, the districts have now also an additional sort of, you didn't catch this kid and we know that they're low income, we're sending them through kind of thing. And there's been a significantly greater amount of sort of the state having a more accurate capture in terms of the number of students that are actually considered low income. In terms of special education, I can tell you, as someone who sat in on most of the meetings of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which came up with the calculation, this was certainly one of the most hotly debated sections. The calculation is based on about a 17 or 18% of your student body receiving special education services, with the idea that most of those students are not receiving those services full-time in your district. If you take them and you sort of squish them into full-time equivalency, it's going to end up the way where we're going to end up with for the end of the Student Opportunity Act is for K through 12 districts having a 4% rate and regional VOTEX having a 5% rate. According to state numbers, that is actually reflective of the state average. Now, I know of very few school districts or school committees that would say that that actually is reflective of what we spend. I think there's also a question in terms of sort of dollar amounts kinds of questions too, in terms of that. But that is where those numbers are coming from, to answer that part of the question.
Can we get Ginny Disorder's question now? Ginny,
Oh, yes, I put ours up there because I think this is something that everybody is concerned about. Our enrollment decreased by over 150 students from October of 21 to 22. And we are now, this year, the way the levy was actually calculated, we're $1.5 million short for the school budget. And you know, reaching our ceiling, we've got 17,500, the way they figured it out. And one question that I have is, in the formula that we used in our recap sheet, we didn't put the correct number of what we're going to get for Chapter 70 funding. It's going to be, I think, $350,000 more. That will help some, but we're only allowed to add up to the levy limit. So I'm the chair of Ways and Means, and I am really struggling with this. And Tracy, I got your number today from a school committee member. I may be speaking with you, but I'm having absolute angst about this and am not quite sure where to go. I don't love the way that we actually did the calculations. And I think that that got us to the part where we can't go up, and I don't know exactly what to do. So whoever can help, please speak up.
Joe, did you have a comment about one of the previous questions? No? Emily Green is the next person with a question.
I put it in the chat, Jesus.
Oh, okay. Emily Green?
Yes, hi. I'm not a teacher and I have nothing to do with education. I'm a retired nurse, but I have a lot of interest in what's going on, especially in the Greenfield school system. I'm trying to understand, is there any kind, you know, I know we're now, 1.5 million short, but you know, my first question is, how is this being impacted between charter versus public education? I am really worried about public education and the fact that the public education seems to have a lot more being drawn away from it, so into these charter. And I'm not sure if I understand that, but I really think every school should be a charter school. And I don't understand why we have to have two different kinds of educational systems in this country. And the second question is, as it became apparent in 2021, when all students were brought back into the classroom and they were not ready and they were totally chaotic and disruptive and everything else. And does our educational system allow for some budget money to pay for another mental health counselor and so forth that was really needed under those kind of circumstances? And we have still those circumstances going on when it comes to racism. So those are my questions. I'm letting whoever wants to address it.
I'm just gonna, so maybe some of that, I think what she's asking is about the charter school tuition and school choice tuition. And for Greenfield, that is a substantial amount of money. I believe it's about $4 million.
4 million towards which one?
So we pay money to other districts for children that leave our district to a charter school or to another public school. And that amount of money for Greenfield is $4 million, which is most of the difference between our foundation budget and actual net school spending.
Yeah, so I can.
So if one of the panelists wants to talk a little bit about school choice and school choice tuition reimbursement, if there's any pending legislation that addresses that.
Yeah, I can speak to the charter funding mechanism. So there are about 90 or so charter schools across the Commonwealth. So students that attend charter schools are counted in their home district foundation budget. So a district like Greenfield would count those students in their foundation enrollment. Those students would be reflected in the state aid, or are reflected in the state aid that Greenfield is receiving. And so, you know, that's part of the funding package. When the money is transferred to the charter schools to fund the tuition for the students from Greenfield that attend charters, that money is taken out through the local aid distribution on a monthly basis. So we determine a charter tuition assessment based on the demographics of the students from Greenfield that are attending charter schools. We use the same kind of foundation budget formula construct that we use for the Chapter 70 program to determine a base tuition amount for all the students from Greenfield who are enrolled in charters. We also add an additional amount above that. We call that the above foundation percentage, which is reflective of any additional funding being spent locally in Greenfield on behalf of Greenfield students, so that the tuition that Greenfield is paying to the charter schools where their students are enrolled is reflective of the local spending that's happening on district students that are attending school in Greenfield Public Schools. So that money is transferred. We do those calculations in the current year, so it's different from Chapter 70 in the sense that Chapter 70 is based on prior year enrollment. So we determine your aid based on enrollment from the prior year. So FY24 enrollment, as Tracy pointed out, FY24 Chapter 78 is based on your October 1, 2022 enrollment. When we assess your charter tuition, we base it on the students that are actually attending charter schools in the year that you're being assessed for that tuition. So in FY24, you'll be assessed for students based on their enrollment status next year. And then that money is deducted off your local aid distribution. The money that's deducted off your local aid distribution is reflective of the state aid that you're receiving for those students, as well as the local share of spending that you're expected to make on behalf of those students that are attending charters. There is a tuition reimbursement formula as well that is designed to help offset the increases that you're seeing in tuition from year to year. And it's phased out over a 3-year period. So one of the components of the SOA now requires us to fully fund the reimbursement entitlement for charter tuitions. So we are doing that. We're actually fully reimbursing the entitlement a year earlier than scheduled. So FY23 will be the first year that we're going to be fully funding that entitlement. And then the requirement will be that we fully fund that at 100% going forward. So what that does is it gives you 100% reimbursement for any tuition increases in the most current year. So in FY23, that's FY22 to FY23, 60% for the year prior, and then 40% for 2 years prior. So the tuition reimbursement phases out over time, as you know, under the theory that local budgets will have had time to adjust during that time frame for students that are moving and enrolling in charter schools.
So I'm actually going to ask a quick question, and then we're
Yep.
going to take a question from Catherine Golub. But my question is actually, what is the difference between school choice tuition and charter tuition?
Yeah, so school choice is a different program altogether. Okay, so school choice, which is governed by Chapter 76, Section 12B, is a program that's been in place since 1992. It allows school districts to accept students from other school districts through an open enrollment, basically. So districts that participate in school choice, we have about 190 or so across the Commonwealth, go through an admissions process to admit students who apply as school choice students to their district on an annual basis. It's a random lottery-based selection process that districts have to go through to identify students, to admit students through school choice. Once a student is admitted in a district through school choice, we then determine a tuition for those students. And then the districts where those students reside are assessed that tuition cost. That's done in real time as well, similar to how we do the charter school program. The difference is that the school choice tuition is capped at $5,000 per student. So it's a much lower rate than the charter tuition rate. In addition, receiving districts can also claim special education costs for school choice students. They do that by costing out any special education services that their school choice students are receiving. We have a claiming process that we use to determine those costs, and those costs can be added to the base tuition amount for any school choice students that the districts are serving. So that it's another program out there. I know Greenfield has a lot of outgoing school choice. It's probably over 200 students, I think, annually.
Yeah,
So-
we have outgoing charter tuition and school choice combined of 4 million.
Okay, yeah, I think the school choice piece is about 2 million.
School choice out is 1,800,000. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Can we get Catherine Golub's question?
Sure, thank you. My question is basically echoing Counselor DeSorger's question. First, I want to say thank you for the presentation to Tracy and to the answers from Robert. I just messaged Doug and said, can I please get a recording of this? Because I've been I don't even have a year yet on city council, and it's my first budget season, and I'm working very hard to wrap my mind around how our schools are funded. And so I know that when I listen to it again, I will have many more specific follow-up questions. But my mind is like, honestly, just right now, okay, trying to take in as much information as possible. And so I don't know if my question is just rhetorical or I am looking for guidance. But just echoing what Counselor DeSorger said of our budget, the budget that we just received from the mayor is $1.5 million less than our superintendent's budget. And I am certain that this is a statewide issue. And I'm also certain that there are local components. I don't yet know what they are, but I'm certain that there's steps that we can take on a local level to remedy this to some extent. And I'm trying to figure out what those are. When we look at DLS numbers and we compare Greenfield to other municipalities, we are not funding our schools to the extent that comparable municipalities are, and there is work to be done on a local level as well. And we have about 6 weeks to this budget season. And so this may be a question that someone has some answer to now, and probably is not, because the focus of this forum is state, and I really want to respect that. And I get how important the state component to this is, but also extraordinarily grateful to Senator Comerford and Representative Sabadosa and Representative Whips for being here, and perhaps one of you has guidance, or someone else who it's a kind of a plea for suggestions to help Greenfield, and perhaps after this to have a conversation, or maybe there's folks from other municipalities or from Greenfield who have recommendations, but we have a short window, and if we cut our budget to any extent, but especially this amount, we will have layoffs. We will have many, many, many layoffs, and many, many unfilled positions, and many cut services. And I can do everything in my power to minimize that. So if folks have guidance, Ginny and I and Counselor Bottomley, who's also here, are all ears.
Well, I'm gonna pop in real quick and say there are a ton of resources. I mean, Tracy's brilliant. She showed us that earlier, and I appreciate you for being here. But we have Mass Municipal Association, and there are a ton of people who have been where you are right now over the last several years, having been a selectman myself. And we talked about this a little bit in our group. It's really hard when we don't provide enough funding for you, and you've got teachers against the police, against the firefighters, against the DPW, and it shouldn't be like that. And it makes it really difficult for counselors and selectmen, and certainly Rep. Sabadosa and Senator Comerford and Rep. Blay and Senator Mark. We all try to do everything we can to pull money out this way. And with the Student Opportunity Act, there's hope. With the new administration, there's some hope. Hope doesn't pay the bills, and we understand that, but we're hopeful that in upcoming years. But reach out to people who have been where you are, because there's a ton of resources and a ton of great people who certainly will mentor and help, or just say, oh yeah, we've been there, we did this, or it all works out in the end. So, please reach out to MMA and anybody. Give me a call if you want to talk to a former selectman sometime, because everybody wants to help.
Thank you.
So I want to get a question from Judy Atkins, but as we get towards the end of the forum, I'd like if maybe the legislators could speak a little bit about any specific pending legislation or legislative ideas, like additional charter school reimbursement, or I know Senator Lewis has a proposal to move the 41% that the state is responsible all the way up to 45%. People have suggested removing the 17.5% cap on minimum state aid to school districts, so that those wealthy communities that can actually fund their school budget entirely on their own with their local school base, which is none of the districts on this chat, they would be putting more money into the state's foundation budget, which would in then turn come back to the districts on this call who actually do need the money and can't. That there's no capacity to raise the taxes locally any more than what we're already doing, or there's not much more. So Judy Atkins, do you have some statements or questions you wanted to make?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks very much for this really informative panel, and thanks for the panelists. And I think like one of the problems that hasn't been talked about is how the increase in cost of health insurance is a real budget buster for the towns, the cities, and the school board budgets and stuff. And the result of the increase in health insurance costs reduces teachers' salaries, right? When teachers go negotiations for their salaries, they also have to face the fact that health insurance is going up. So it's an increase in cost for both the city and town budgets and for individual teachers' salaries. So I think, we should sort of fold the support for Medicare for all in the state into what we're saying for solutions for increased funding. And I have to thank Senator Joe Comerford and Representative Lindsay Sabadosa and Representative Susanna Whips, and also Natalie Blay for signing on as co-sponsors for this bill. But I think it would be good for people at every level to see how important it would be to pass Medicare for all in Massachusetts. And I put the numbers of the Senate bill and the House bill in the chat and stuff.
You put those in the chat?
It's in the chat. Yeah, so it's SD 2182 and HD 1584 then. So
Okay.
thanks, and keep this in mind. It would be a great victory to start moving this forward. And
If I can just
Question-
add to that, it is the second largest cost of any school district in Massachusetts after salaries.
Right.
Health
The
insurance.
savings would be huge, you know.
Doug, just a quick question, for your do we have, are we gonna have a record of the chat for people who wanna get back that?
We will.
Okay,
Thanks.
all right.
And I have a question. I actually have two questions. One, and this is for the representatives and Senator Comerford. Part of the focus of this this forum is moving beyond Greenfield to recognize that this is a statewide issue. And so I'm wondering, with the schools in your districts or the areas you cover, are you seeing similar to what you've heard described? And can you talk a little bit about that, about what you're seeing out there, how consistent what we're experiencing here is? And I know that, Martha, you're in rural land in terms of categories, so maybe it's qualitatively different in terms of what you're experiencing. And my second question, and again, this is primarily for the legislators, is schools have been underfunded, or I guess, Rob, I would include you in this too. Schools have been underfunded, certainly Greenfield has, for decades. And I know there are formulas and things are allocated according to formula, but is there any sort of monitoring or assessment that goes on that says, here's what the numbers say it should be, but here's what really happens, which is we're digging a constantly larger hole. And that part of why people are choicing out of districts is because those districts have not been able to afford to keep people and to keep programs that would keep kids in the schools. And so is there plans to, how is what's actually happening in the schools monitored, and how will it be monitored going forward? So if things aren't working, no matter what the formula says they should be doing, if it's not working to serve the schools, that we can move more quickly. I mean, I'm glad the Student Opportunity Act is happening, but we've been sinking for decades and seemingly nothing was done. So two different questions: what's happening outside of Greenfield in schools, and then how can we monitor what's going on to be more on top of responding? To any of you.
Can I actually jump in? I have two answers.
Go ahead, Tracy.
So we were talking at the beginning that there's sort of a whole bunch of different paths that school districts are going on right now. So the first thing is that I want to note that there are districts for which it being year 3 of the Student Opportunity Act matters. So we're still seeing phase in. So for districts that are high, low income and predominantly state funded, we're going to continue to see districts coming out of hold harmless and into foundation funding. My example, I was keeping an eye on them from the beginning, was Orange. Orange came out last year and they actually got real foundation aid. They got real increases. It's been like night and day for them. I think of Orange as being a baby gateway. But it isn't only Orange. And I think that part of what I think is really important is to whatever, Rob's been doing a great job of sort of doing a lot of coaching with school districts, because there's a lot of people having to do calculations they haven't had to do before, where they haven't really had to look at what is our foundation budget, what is our target share, how does it actually work? But we need more school districts to actually be running those calculations to see what the impact of the next 3 years are going to be, to see if they're going to be one of those districts. Because I'm seeing a lot of despair in places where I don't think it's always universally true. Now, that isn't the story of the districts that continue to have decline. Martha's, got that one down in terms of those kinds of stories. That we had some of that conversation in the breakout room I was in. The other thing that I was going to put in the chat is the Student Opportunity Act does say it requires that the foundation budget be reconsidered every 5 years. So we don't need a bill this year, but that's going to be the thing that I'm going to start agitating my legislators for, come next year is, okay, so that means we got to go study it again. And we got to see if it's actually time for it to be updated, because we can't wait another 25 years like we did last time. That's how we ended up where we did.
So I just want to say that Tracy Novick put her contact information in the chat. So if people have follow-up questions specifically for her that might be more district specific, her contact information is there, so you can reach out to her. We're at the end of any questions that are in the chat. So if people do have additional questions, feel free to add them in. Otherwise, I definitely have a question that I want to throw in.
Well, if I could jump in to Doug's question, if
Yeah.
that's okay.
Absolutely.
So this has been really amazing, and I'm so grateful to Tracy and Rob and everybody for organizing this. So Doug, you asked what's happening in a number of district schools, not only Greenfield. This is how I describe the hold harmless buffer, right? This is what's Amherst right now and Northampton. Amherst is a little bit further from the minimum aid. Northampton's just about to break through, maybe next year if my math is correct. Tracy's nodding, so maybe my math was correct. I did a little math, Tracy. But the issue is really one of declining enrollment. This is a real thing. Greenfield, Amherst, Northampton, Gilmontague, Mohawk, Pioneer, we're all losing kids out here. And this is real. So when we lose kids, we lose money. And that is just a real deal. And that's why we have these very, very large buffers in some of our districts, because foundation can't eat through. Think of this as like, think of the foundation budget as like a giant Pac-Man trying to push through, but it's got such a gap to get through because our districts have been losing kids. So in fact, they should have gotten, except the state won't let them get, less and less Chapter 70 aid, but they get this minimum aid, which is weenie compared to what inflation is, but still so much more than they would have gotten because they're losing kids. And this is a real struggle, which is why the rural and low and declining enrollment bill is, I believe, so critical. I'll also just say special education, I put it in the chat, there isn't one district, I believe, I haven't checked in the last, 3 months, but I don't think there's one district that has special education thresholds at or below 17% in our district, with some of our communities having exceedingly more. What does this mean? Does it mean communities turn away kids? No, they educate the kids, but the community pays. I think it's one of the things Tracy talked about, the next SOA. That's on my bucket list. It's also in the rural schools bill. We are penalizing school districts for educating kids on IEPs. And it's just true that special education often correlates with poverty. And so where we have high concentrations of poverty, we have high concentrations of special education students. And this is very difficult. And that is on school districts with very tight budgets or municipalities with very few people, it's really hard to absorb special education costs. The other thing I want to talk about, and how could I not, because Mike Naughton's on the call, is the combined effort yield. So I love the nerdy Tracy Novick more than anything. So the CEY calculation was a subject of the Ways and Means hearing that was held recently at UMass Amherst, because there's numbers of people who have been listening to Mike Naughton and Tupper Brown for a long time from Gilmontague. And what they would tell us, friends, and what I subscribe to, is that the combined effort yield currently, which is capped at 82.5%, currently in our districts, again, almost universally in the Senate district, our communities struggle to get to that 82.5% cap. But the big, rich, wealthy communities could blow past that cap in their sleep. That's true. They could pay 3, 4, 5 times more than the state tells them that they can or should. So what does that mean? That means over time, as more and more communities actually can blow past that cap, our communities are essentially bearing a disproportionate weight. And then there's the other piece about who pays more, the municipality or the state. So those are the two pieces of the combined effort yield that are really real for our communities. And I'll say just a couple more things, 2 things. One is charter reform. It is something that must come. There was, before the pandemic, there was a big conversation about charter schools. And this is not a fight for the grocery store aisle. This is just not. It's a state issue. And I do believe, again, that in communities with low and declining enrollment, to lose a kid to a charter, even though I think every community, I mean, Worcester just went through the charter school, which Tracy was very much a part of. Every community that loses kids to charters, again, families have a right to tell, where their kid wants to go. The kids have a right. I can't disparage individuals. The state has to figure out how we adequately compensate districts, because the 3-year formula, which basically weans a community off a school, which we're funding now, and that's good, fully funding. I'm totally for fully funding the sort of wean out formula. It's just not enough. It's not enough. If Greenfield lost 57 kids between last year and the year between FY23 and FY24, it's that those 57 kids in an already small district are too many, and some of them went to charters. And so we both have to figure out how we deal with charter policy reform, and then we actually have to think about the money, especially for school districts like ours, and how we compensate districts for charter schools. I will stop on my soapbox now, and then the rural schools bill, we could use help on that. The rural schools bill is real. It came out of this commission. It was a badass commission. Desi was an important part of this commission. Certainly Tracy, I know, was consulted in it. I believe anyway. I believe the commission consulted you, but tell me I'm wrong. And 38 recommendations that were put together by beautiful minds. And the bill doesn't have all 38, but it has a lot of them, including a healthcare recommendation, although I agree Medicare for all is what we need, and numbers of other recommendations, like the way we have to fund special education transportation, other kind of budget busters. And the really last thing I'll say is all the other stuff that Tracy talked about, there's other money that comes in, like regional school transportation. Thanks to Desi and the administration, we're getting close to that 100. But if Ann Goby were here, she'd be pounding her desk saying, 90% isn't 100, and it's our job to do that, because we're asking districts to consider combining forces, and we said we'd pay. And transportation is a walloping cost. With that, there are other good things that happened, right? Special education transportation is inside the circuit breaker. That's good. That's very good. The governor filed more money to deal with the 766 schools. Those are the out of district placements. That's good, although we have to get that formula right. There are other good things that are happening in the short term, but there's lots of long-term work to do.
So I just want to make a quick clarifying point that for Greenfield, for enrollment, which is different than what we're losing to school choice, it's 57 students that we lost. I think the 150 number is something different, which includes kids choicing out. But
I said 57. I mean,
no, you said 57. Yeah, but it's 150 is being reported, and that's a different. It relates to a different number. It's not enrollment. But we have a question from Dorothy. Well, actually, we have two questions. Dorothy Jank. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
Janky.
Sorry. And then there's also one from Paul Jabloni, but I think him and Tracy there was a conversation. So I'm gonna wait till, so Dorothy, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, this has got to do with wasting money. I have heard that the mayor wants to spend $1 million to cut off bank rows so cars can't go through there. So she can have people sitting there and eating or something. And from what I've heard and what surveys have made, the town people do not want that to happen. And they could serve the Cocina Lupita food truck could park on the common side of that road, and people could still get food and eat on the common where there are tables and chairs, and the road could still be used for cars. But anyway, we have these temporary things that they have put up for this, and they are already paid for and in place. But the mayor wants to spend $1 million to do something she wants to do. And to me, that $1 million should be going to the schools and paying the teachers and that million and whatever that we're shy, that she took away from the school budget, the mayor could can her road project and we could fund the schools, which to me is far more important. Any-
So Danny or the mayor, Danny Letourneau or the mayor or someone from the city side isn't here to answer that. Ginny Disorder, maybe you would want to answer or speak to that, or I'm not sure that anybody here can speak to those specifically.
I don't think that that is a question that we can solve here. I think I heard Joe and Natalie say we elect our legislators and they make choices. And so we don't get to determine that. That would be I think you basically said that on Saturday at a legislative coffee. We don't make the individual decisions for how we're spending. And I think that might've had to do with ARPA, but if I'm speaking out of turn, by all means.
No, you're correct, Ginny. I think when we were speaking, wow, I'm getting feedback. I'm sorry about that. When we were speaking the other day, people had asked us, do you tell the mayor or a municipal leader how they spend money that comes in from the state? Well, no, you elect your mayor to make those decisions. Certainly, if you get money for a complete street or 4 roads, you have to spend it on roads. If you get money from the state for schools, it must be spent on schools. So sometimes we don't really have the energy nor the time to stand over a town manager's shoulder and watch what they do. We stay busy on our own, so we're not going to micromanage any of the cities because that doesn't fall under our legislative duties. But just to kind of talk about education, but also so many other pieces of what the revolution is doing, because we do have declining enrollment. One of the biggest issues we have around declining enrollment is lack of affordable housing. And every realtor in the area will tell you the inventory's down. So what we've been talking about is the silver tsunami and all of those wonderful baby boomers who are leaving the job market and in a big house that they have raised their family in, and this might be too much house, might be too expensive for them, but there's absolutely no place for seniors to move that's safe, affordable, accessible, and in their community so they can age in place. So we need to address housing. Another thing we need to address is transportation. Another thing is healthcare. I mean, all of those things, we're not going to do one thing and save the schools and get all the money. But there are so many other little pieces that we're working on with regards to housing, healthcare, mental and behavioral health, and COVID, as somebody had brought up earlier about the detrimental effect it had on our students. COVID affected people from 8 months to 80 years old. I mean, there are a lot of people who suffered being at home, being isolated. So we do have a second wave of this pandemic, and it really is a mental and behavioral health crisis that's affecting many people. And you throw on top of that, already economically challenged, you might have housing insecurity, you might have food insecurity. There's a lot going on right now. And one, I appreciate all of you for being here and having and women's healthcare and women's rights and rights of people of color and rights of people from different places to come here. So, I mean, what you're doing is amazing and we need to replicate it. But of all of those little subcommittees you have going on with your revolution, we have those in the legislature, and we all have kind of our pet projects that we're working on. But this issue isn't going to be solved by just DESE or just the administration or just the legislature. It's all of us working together and finding a plan keep Massachusetts the wonderful place it is. And again, we rank the best in education. It's not good enough though, especially when you come to our rural communities. And we fight really hard because we know when a bucket of money comes out of Beacon Hill, it starts being spread right out in there in Boston. And by the time it gets to us, it tends to flow a little less easy. So that's something that we also are working on with regards to regional equity, pilot money for our communities, because so many of our communities have state property, state parks, DCR owned land. We've never been paid our fair share for with regards to pilot and non-taxable money. And you know, you only have to look as far as the Quabbin Reservoir to see that we do an awful lot for the Commonwealth. And so we're trying really hard to make sure that all that we provide for this Commonwealth comes back to us. So I appreciate what you're doing and all of the questions tonight. And I look forward to hearing from you more about all of your topics, because we have to do better in all of it.
Thanks. I wanted to just jump in and ask Representative Sabadosa, who's not gotten a word in edgewise, if there's something you would like to, not putting you on the spot, but offering an invitation.
No, thank you, Doug. Well, I got to listen to Tracy tonight, so that was a special treat. And I always learn something every time she talks. I think as the sole representative here who does not represent Greenfield in any way, shape, or form, I will take a minute to talk about other districts and what we're seeing. So I represent the city of Northampton, which has 2 school districts, Northampton and Smith Folk, Hatfield, the smallest independent school district in the state. And then I have 3 regionalized high schools, 4 regionalized elementary schools, and 1 regionalized middle school. So we get to see a lot of what's going on. And one of the things I've been doing is visiting all of those schools. I got to spend yesterday with Martha, in fact, at Mohawk. So that was lovely. And it has been really interesting because every community really does have its own message. So Worthington, with its tiny elementary school that just opened an EEC program, is seeing people move into town because they're so excited by the fact that there is childcare. I was at Wacona, which serves Cummington. They actually are not seeing declining enrollment. They can't even take school choice students because they're growing. Their regional elementary school is growing. The principal said, if you could do anything for me, give me more rooms, because we have kids that are coming in. And that is definitely not the case in every district, but I do see signs that there are things that are going well in our schools. I do see them all as really joyful, wonderful places. And I am a little traumatized when I see the news that tries to portray them as anything other than really fabulous places. But in terms of funding, it is a challenge. And I think the more I talk to the different districts, the more it becomes clear that there is never one formula that is going to work for everybody. There is no one size fits all. These districts are not one size fits all. Their needs are very different. The demands of the teachers, the administrators, who are all really working hard to provide a good education, are very, very different. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well in these conversations. So it was very interesting for me this evening to hear more about what's going on in Greenfield and in some of the other communities. So thank you for having me here, even though I don't represent the city of Greenfield.
I just want to throw something out there, which is that one thing that I noticed as I started talking with people about this issue is that there is a lot of information about potential pending legislation or potential ideas for potential pending legislation, but Western Mass as a region has some pretty unique needs that the rest of the state maybe doesn't. And so one thing that I was trying to propose to this group of people that are here today in general is the possibility of an in-person annual meeting to take place after the governor's budget message, but before the budget is finalized in June, to basically throw out the pending legislative ideas and start to organize so that we can actually get people to testify at state at Senate hearings, in Ways and Means, so that we're not just talking about them and then contacting our legislators individually, but that it's it's a larger collective effort. So that's just something I'd like to throw out there, is the possibility of an annual meeting to take place on the subject of state school funding, so that legislators can really organize people who really want to see more funding happen, and focus their energy on specific pieces of legislation or specific ideas. The other thing that I wanted to throw out there, and this is specifically to the legislators, is it unrealistic to ask the state if we can have like a one-time funding like allocation that's separate from all of this to make up at least partially for 20 years of underfunded schools? Because I mean, there's a chart from Mass Budget and Policy Center that indicates that for the last 20 years, Chapter 70 money hasn't kept pace with inflation. And even if Student Opportunities Act is going to fix some of that going forward, and there's more charter school reimbursement and all of these other things happening, so many districts have already been underfunded for so long. Like, how do we get through just this year? Can legislators actually make a request to go after some of that state budget surplus as a one-time funding windfall for all of these low-income communities? Can any legislator maybe speak to that? Or I think we're at the end of the meeting, honestly.
Yeah, I'm happy to, there's 1 minute left. I'd really like Senator Comerford just to wrap us up, but we're happy to carry on the conversation, Jesus, following this.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, I appreciate your thinking, and I appreciate your interest in, galvanizing the public, right? Because I do think the State House is a better place when people are present in the work. What you're talking about, a one-time funding, would be billions of dollars, right? If we looked at all the school districts.
I mean, it would be billions for all 20 years. Yeah, it'd be like $40 billion. But I'm talking about like a one-time, $1 to $2 billion funding for this year to bridge some of the gap between Student Opportunities Act and implementation, and where we're at now.
Right. I think 1 to 2 billion, over 351 cities and towns is just not going to be enough to do. I hear what you're saying. You want kind of transformational funding. I do want to bring us back to what Tracy talked about. This is, the middle of what hopefully will be a more robust for communities like Greenfield. Again, communities like Amherst, communities like Northampton, that, there's a scale of 1 to 12 in terms of where a community is located. For money, for SOA money, closer to 12 is better. Greenfield's at 10.
Yeah.
Northampton, Amherst are smack in the middle. So that plus their hold harmless, that's one of the reasons that communities like that are in jeopardy in the shorter term. But anyway, I'm not saying I don't want to invalidate your good idea. I want to go back to what Rep. Whip said, which is, we need money everywhere, right? We need money for transit, for early childcare, for housing, God help us, for workforce development. All of these are agonizingly underfunded right now. So the likelihood of a big play for $1 to $2 billion in this budget cycle at this moment when the House budget is due, in a matter of a handful of days, I think you guys, is very unlikely. The budgets are baked. But can we go farther? Oh, no, I'm hearing you did before. Anyway, you're not wrong, Jesus. I just don't think it's a feasible ask for this budget cycle, which is right here happening now. But can we do better for communities across all of the areas that Rep. Whip's identified, plus education? Yes, we can. And that's the truth, and that's the work ahead. That plus regional equity to make sure that Western Mass gets our fair share of the rising tide in the Healy Driscoll budget, which I do believe the governor is committed to too.
So let me jump in to say that we have gone a little bit over time. We may not have solved it all tonight. But the intention of the forum was to start the conversation where we are, with the intention of having this be a launch to next and additional efforts. We have emails of people who were here. That was part of your registration, and we will follow up. We're interested in working with as many people who is interested or working and that we can gather to push for change for the schools. Thank you all for being here. Thanks the panel. Thanks to everybody who signed up and stayed with us. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Happy to do it. We'll do more.
Thank you.